Welcome to The Academic Issue, your go-to podcast on Canadian academia. We are University Affairs, Canada's premier publication dedicated to higher education. For over 60 years, we've been at the heart of the nation's university community, providing news, commentary, and advice to those working in the hallowed halls across the country. Whether you're a seasoned professor, a curious grad student, or just intrigued by the inner workings of university life, we've got you covered. I'm Kate Kenyon, digital content creator for University Affairs, and I'm looking at the forces shaping higher education today and what they mean for you. So join me as I explore life through the academic lens. This is The Academic Issue. Professor Steven Pinker is a cognitive scientist and the author of 9 books written for the general public, including The Language Instinct and Enlightenment Now. Originally from Montreal, Steven now lives in the US and is the Johnston Family Professor of Psychology at Harvard University. He's an example of an academic who has taken public engagement to the nth degree, prolific not just in his popular writing, but also in his media appearances. He's given multiple TED Talks, appeared on podcasts including Freakonomics and The Joe Rogan Experience, and writes frequently for The Guardian and The New York Times. His ability to communicate complex ideas about language, the mind, and human nature using accessible language, and his keenness to participate in public discourse place him among the most prominent public intellectuals of his time. But what impact does a lifetime communicating with the public have on an academic? How is writing for a general audience different to writing for an academic one? And what role should the public intellectual play in today's information age? I spoke with Steven in his office at Harvard University. Steven Pinker, thank you so much for being on the Academic Issue podcast. I'm going to start by taking you back 30 years to the publication of your very first trade book. And by that, I mean a book written for a general audience. What made you think, I'm going to write a book for the public?
Part of it was reaction that I got from people when I told them what I do for a living. Like, what do you do? Well, I'm a professor. What do you study? Well, I study language, how children acquire it, who decides what's correct or incorrect, where is it in the brain, how did it evolve? And the reaction was always, wow, that's really interesting. And I was a consumer of trade science books at the time, books on evolution, books on medicine, but there did not exist a trade book on pretty much any aspect of modern cognitive science, including language. And I thought, well, that's a niche that I could fill. Around that time, I'd always been interested in good writing, partly just as a craft to be mastered, but also as someone who studies language, there's the psychological question of what makes writing good. And obviously, if you're an academic, what makes writing bad? Because most academic writing is bad. What makes prose seem turgid, opaque, incoherent? So I always wrote with a kind of a parallel attention to what are the psycholinguistic processes that go on in composing and in reading. So I was conscious about the act of good writing. And I did have an editor at a university press who said, have you thought of trying your hand at it? He didn't put it in exactly these words, but he said, by academic standards, your writing doesn't suck.
What a compliment.
Yes. Well, I took it as a compliment. And I had been, myself, I'd always tried in my academic writing to be clear, occasionally even to be stylish. I had savored the work of people in my field who were good writers as well as eminent academics. And psychology does have a history of excellent writers. The most famous is probably my hero, William James. And we are actually now talking in William James Hall, which pleases me. But I think one of the best nonfiction writers in the history of the English language. And he was a professor of psychology at Harvard. George Miller, a well-known cognitive psychologist who began one of the most cited articles in the history of my field on limits of memory. The article is called The Magical Number 7 Plus or Minus 2. And the first sentence in the article is, my problem is I have been pursued by an integer. Now that's a stylish way of opening an academic article and shows that contrary to what many of my students suspect that if you write well, it will sabotage your academic career. There have been eminent academics who've also been good writers. B.F. Skinner, author of several bestsellers, Beyond Freedom and Dignity, Walden 2, also here at Harvard, was also a fine writer. D.O. Hebb in Canada was a very clear and stylish writer. So you can combine them, and then the combination of what I thought of as the kind of market opportunity, namely people would be interested in a book on language, and this seemed like a worthy project or exercise for me to take on, led me to write it.
Was it a bit of a relief for you at the time to be reading trade books on the side because you were, embedded in academic writing as well? Were you getting that relief from it? Normal, plain
Yes, there's more pleasure in reading. I mean, anything that's well written.
Yeah.
It also opened up for me a whole different mindset toward writing, and people are often surprised to hear this. You actually have to be much more careful and rigorous in writing for a wide audience than writing an academic paper. People sometimes think it might be the other way around, but I think it's in academia, who is vetting the quality of your work? Like 2 peer reviewers, each of whom is busy, is not being paid for it, and we know this to be true, will review with an eye toward what they want to be true or what their own axes are that they want to grind. And so if they're sympathetic, they give you a pass. If they don't like what you're writing, they'll pick every nit. But still, it's only like, 2 or 3, and you can kind of get away with a lot. If you write for a wide audience, there could be hundreds of thousands of people reading your prose over a wide range of degrees of expertise in different subject matters. People are often obsessed, amateurs with particular topics, and fellow academics, because academics read trade books too. But it means there are an awful lot of eyeballs looking at what you write. And for a lot of them, they would like nothing more than to show the fancy schmancy MIT professor that he's made a mistake that they have caught. So I have learned to be much more assiduous in looking stuff up, fact-checking, second-guessing my own memory than I did when I wrote as an academic. First thing I did when I decided to write The Language Instinct is I went out and I bought a big unabridged dictionary. And this is before the World Wide Web, way before Wikipedia. I bought a desktop encyclopedia. I bought Bartlett's Familiar Quotations, so I could actually look up quotations instead of just attributing everything to Einstein and Mark Twain.
It's always Mark Twain.
It's always Mark Twain. And there was a kind of pleasure in holding yourself to the standard of, instead of just attributing something to Mark Twain, how about looking it up? And I own complete works of William Shakespeare, the King James Bible, and I had them on my desk. And becoming not just a specialist in my case, language acquisition in children and visual cognition, but someone who's really in the Republic of Letters, someone who's responsible for scholarly accuracy to a standard that is, again, contrary to people's expectations, higher in writing for the general public than in writing an academic article.
And style aside, did writing in that way benefit you as an academic in your appreciation or understanding of your field?
Absolutely. Because it, not just the mechanics of crafting clear prose, which in my field of psycholinguistics was a two-way street, but also homing in on what is most interesting in your field, because you've got to make that case. You don't have a captive audience of fellow hyper-specialists. It's like, why should I care about irregular verbs? Well, it forces you to ask that question about what you're doing.
You've sort of taken them for granted once you delve into the narrow world of academia, right? You have to sort of come out of the academic mine shaft to look at it from a general audience's point of view.
That's exactly right. It forces you to go back to the fundamental questions. And it often did lead to insights, which then fed back into my own research.
So when you write for the public, is there a person in your mind who you're writing for? Do you see the audience? I also wonder, you've talked about the mistake that some academics can make in thinking that in writing for a general audience, you should imagine someone of low education.
Yes.
Can you tell us about that?
This is some of the advice that I got from a university press editor who had herself edited books, both specialized academic books and occasionally more general interest books. And she said that the academics do make the mistake of, when they do try to cross over, of condescending to their audience, of assuming that they are either chicken pluckers and truck drivers and assembly line workers, and also generally kind of condescending to readers who are not themselves professors. And she said, that's the wrong way to think. First of all, most chicken pluckers aren't going to buy your book. So don't write for them.
Too busy plucking chickens.
Indeed. Think of writing for your college roommate or friend in college who is as smart as you, but happened to go into a different line of work. They became a teacher or a banker or a software engineer. So they don't know what you know, but they are, by the very fact of buying your book, they are eager to find out. So don't presuppose anything, but give them credit for both being interested in and capable of understanding sophisticated ideas.
Is there any other advice that you now give? I assume you're approached by other academics.
Yes.
You've written nine trade books now, so you really know what you're doing. You've had wild success with it. Do other academics considering doing this come to you?
So now I give them my book, The Sense of Style,
okay.
which is, but I also explain some of the lessons. And one of the main lessons in The Sense of Style, and the title of one of the chapters was The Curse of Knowledge, a psychological phenomenon in which people have a lot of trouble understanding what it's like not to know something that they know. Once you know something, it seems all too self-evident, and you have to remind yourself that people who are not in your clique, who don't have your personal history, may not be familiar with this technical term, this jargon, even the whole rationale for studying something in the first place. It just becomes second nature. And so that would be the first piece of advice. I often wrote, I guess if I were to have a reader in mind, one of them was my mother, the late Rosalind Weisenfeld Pinker, but not for the reasons that most academics would state. When they say, try to make it so your mother can understand, they have a rather patronizing and somewhat sexist image of your mother as...
Who's home washing dishes and has never read anything.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, my mother was highly intelligent, highly sophisticated, not a professor. And so if I could get my mother to understand something or make it interesting to her, that was kind of a model. And again, it was be an intellectual peer who just happened not to go into academia as a line of work.
Who do you rely on most intimately now with your intellectual ideas? Who sees your ideas and writing before it goes public?
Well, I'm fortunate enough to be married to another writer and intellectual influence, Rebecca Goldstein. Before we even met, she had published, each of us had read the other's work. She is a novelist and a philosopher. But she and I, together with having made the transition from academia to general writing, so something that we share, but we also share an intellectual stance. We both appreciate knowledge. We're both realists in the sense of we're not postmodernists. We believe there is such a thing as objective truth and that one could strive for it. We both appreciate analytic philosophy together with psychology. I think politically we're pretty close. So close enough. I mean, obviously not, not clones, but enough so that we can appreciate what the other is trying to accomplish and therefore serve as a commenter, critic, suggester of relevant ideas.
I've heard you talk about your wife previously to the media. This was years ago. I was living in London, and you appeared on Desert Island Discs on Radio 4.
Yes.
I don't know if you remember this.
How can I forget Desert Island Discs?
Yes, and you were it was my introduction to you. That's how I first heard of you, and it was also my introduction to Leonard Cohen, so thank you. And I remember you talked about your wife for the Leonard Cohen piece, where you mentioned that you sing I'm Your Man every Valentine's Day. I don't know if you remember saying this. I'd never forgotten it.
I did say this, and I got correspondence from men saying, damn, now I have to sing I'm Your Man. Yes.
Well, the reason I bring this up is to talk about fame. You are a public figure, and you've made media appearances like Desert Island Discs, where you talk not necessarily about your research, but about yourself.
Yes.
People will naturally have an interest in you as an individual. Where do you draw that line beyond which it's not for sale? How do you make that decision?
Yes, and there have probably been occasions when I haven't drawn it in the right place.
It's probably difficult under pressure with the cameras rolling.
Yes. Well, one line is, does it affect other people who have not volunteered to be in that particular interview? And so, especially when it comes to a marriage and family members and students, so intimate detail where other people have not given their informed consent would be a very strong line. Part of the problem is actually the opposite, that since, and I'm saying this as a psychologist, since all of us are so concerned with self-presentation, naturally, we all are involved in PR campaigns for ourselves. Often the problem is you're not divulging your true self. You're divulging your own, who you want other people to think of you as. And here's a little secret about Desert Island Discs. As you, accept the assignment and choose the 10 discs, it really isn't the ones you'd want to bring to a desert island. It's the ones that you could have a good story to tell about on the BBC.
I thought you were about to say it's the music that you think makes you look cool.
Well, yes, and that too. And that too.
I feel that.
Yes, exactly.
Definitely.
Like, even if I happen not to be a Barry Manilow fan, but had I been a Barry Manilow fan, I would not confess that on Desert Island Discs.
But yes. That's very interesting to hear you say that. I would definitely be curating my songs.
No question.
Oh, definitely.
Plus, I had a book that had just come out, and it's like, how can I tie one of these into the book?
Oh, yeah.
So
marketing.
Yeah.
On that note, because you've become well known, what comes with fame is the two sides of it: the accolade, the praise, the interest in you. And then on the other side, there's the condemnation, the Twitter pylons, the negativity and criticism. By choosing a public path, haven't you opened yourself up as a scientist to influences on your neutrality as a person, the flattery and the criticism?
Yes, it is a hazard. Although, of course, in any professional career, there is the hazard of what leads to career success in the terms of a good job and a good reputation and a good readership compared to the standards of integrity of what you're doing. Ideally, those should be perfectly aligned. But again, I think in going back to factual accuracy, there is a sense in which being a public figure forces you to hold to greater standards of integrity than if you were, I hate to say, a mere academic. That sounds terrible. If you were just an academic, because you are in the public eye, there are a lot of people who are going to be gunning for you, that they can make a career out of showing, that you're wrong or that you're bad. You have some mindfulness of the standards that you exemplify, so I feel I'm being held to higher standards.
And is that your raison d'etre? Is that your main purpose in being a public intellectual, to communicate and interpret data truthfully, accurately? Or has it expanded now to social criticism, cultural criticism, the stuff of the great public intellectuals of the last century?
Yeah. Well, the original motivation, and still the primary one, is to explain what I consider to be exciting, intellectually pleasurable discoveries from the fields that I'm familiar with, and to share them, to give it away. But I have discovered that often, at least by my lights, some of the discoveries, some of the attitudes, some of the mindset from my field, I think can productively illuminate issues of general concern.
With the rise of misinformation and the so-called post-truth era that we find ourselves in, do you think the role of the public intellectual has become more important? And what strategies do you think public academics, public voices like yourself, can use to counter misinformation effectively?
Yeah. I think it is more important. I'd put it differently, and I took up this question when I wrote my book Rationality, where even though my original motivation for writing the book was that I thought that every educated person should be familiar with I identified 7 basic tools of rationality, the 7 normative models of how we ought to reason, and be aware of how the human mind left to its own devices will often flout these standards. So probability, logic, game theory, Bayesian reasoning. But when I first taught a course with this theme and then turned it into a book, the frequently asked question was, oh, good, you're writing a book on rationality. You're teaching a course on rationality. Can you explain why the world seems to be losing its mind? That is, how can you explain the fake news, the conspiracy theories, and the paranormal woo-woo? So it was a question very much on my mind. And far from being in a new post-truth era, I think post-truth is kind of the default condition, the standard condition for humans, other than for their immediate experience, for things like, is there food in the fridge, and are the kids going to get to school on time? When it comes to history, when it comes to politics, when it comes to science, these questions, it's really only in the last few hundred years since the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment that there really were anything like objectively correct answers to questions like, why do people get sick? Where did human beings come from? How old is the universe? How did planet Earth come into being? Kind of any myth was as good as any other myth, and that's the natural way we think. Now, the reason that we rightfully object to fake news and misinformation and conspiracy theories is that we do have now an apparatus for ascertaining the truth, highly fallible and error-prone one. Things like the court system with its adversarial proceedings, science with its peer review and empirical testing, democracy with its checks and balances, journalism with its fact-checking and sourcing and error correction, government record-keeping agencies. These are kind of an infrastructure of truth-seeking. Not a guaranteed way of finding the truth. We don't have one, but one that could and has kind of bumbled its way toward greater and greater truth. It's only through those institutions that anyone can say anything about what's true, when it goes beyond their immediate experience. And so any academic who seeks to become a voice for kind of guiding people away from the fake news toward truth has to have the credibility of that institution. And that's an area in which we've been, meaning universities, scientific societies, many journalistic outputs have been, I think, falling short, in fact, going headlong in the wrong direction. Namely, if you brand yourself as a mouthpiece of some political ideology, and for academic, scientific, and journalistic outlets, it's primarily been on the left, then people on the right and center will blow you off. And in some ways, they might be right to blow you off, because if there's repression of controversy or dissenting opinions, if there's a rush to judgment, if there is premature claims to certainty, people will sniff that out and just consider so-called experts to be just another self-interested priesthood. And we do have a revolt against expertise. I think most of it is misplaced. I think you're still really better off trusting someone who writes for the Globe and Mail than a random TikToker.
So you feel that the public has perhaps lost its faith and its belief in subject matter experts like public intellectuals?
Oh, it absolutely has. I mean, we know this from public opinion polling, which shows that trust in journalism is tanking. Trust in academia is plummeting. Trust in government certainly is sinking fast. And part of that is that the journalists and academics and scientists themselves have been endorsing or presupposing the correctness of left-wing views in a way that turns off people who aren't themselves on the left. And in fact, there has been premature certainty. We now know several years past the pandemic that a lot of the public health measures that were being forced on people did not have scientific support even then. Wearing masks on beaches, for example, plexiglass barriers. And so there was a forfeiting of credibility by prematurely forcing on people intrusions on their life that did not even have scientific support at the time. Even when the experts are right, having forfeited credibility, they no longer have the claim of confidence. So even when it comes to something like anthropogenic climate change, where the scientific consensus is almost certainly correct, human activity really is warming the planet. But people can say, well, why should I trust the scientific consensus if everyone knows that if you disagree with it, you get canceled? So we have to kind of clean off and safeguard the credibility of our institutions. This is a collective effort, and there's barely any awareness that that is a problem among our august scientific and scholarly institutions. They've been falling over themselves to outdo each other in woke pronouncements.
Do you think, though, that it's even possible these days to speak publicly without being politicized in one direction or another? And perhaps that's also, I don't know, do you think academics considering becoming more public voices hold back because of that fear?
I think they do. So many things have become politicized. We do know from surveys that even within the university, a majority of students feel that they can't say what they think because they would get canceled, punished, denounced, shamed. And that would, I've noticed a reticence of many of my scholarly peers to share their expertise in public because it might involve coming out on the wrong side of a highly politicized issue.
Is it one of your aims to influence policy, or is that nothing to do with why you write?
Well, somewhat. I don't have the delusion that I can, but to at least enrich the conversation on policy.
Yeah.
To expand the number of ideas that are taken into account. Mm-hmm. So in the case, the cognizant of the danger of, which we know from cognitive psychology is a danger of distorting your factual beliefs in service of your goals. At the same time, there are some things that I want, and I try not to let one of them contaminate the other. But there are areas in which, I think that what I have written about could constructively feed back, such as the fact that a lot of progress has happened that people are unaware of as a result of policy changes. I myself have changed my mind. By the same token, I hope other people will change their minds, not because I want them to agree with me, but just because the discoveries that have changed my mind, I think, ought to be broadly known. And just to be concrete, I used to be, I think, kind of have a somewhat libertarian skepticism of kind of nanny state interventions, of intrusive safety regulations and mandates, until I plotted graphs on deaths from various hazards. How many people die in car crashes, in falls, in occupational hazards, from drowning, from fires, plane crashes, and seeing that in every case, they've come down a lot. We really objectively are way, way safer than people were 50 or 100 years ago. As the result of all of these safety regulations, I realized, they really were a good thing. Likewise, pollution regulations. The pollution has come way down, and people are often unaware of it until they see the graphs. That suggests that these are not just intrusive government nuisances, but they really do make life better for people. I know for a fact that people are unaware of these things. I can't force them to change their minds, but they should be aware of them, come to their own conclusions, and not be ignorant of them.
Yeah. In the afterword to the blank slate, you referred to the thousands of emails and messages that you get from the public. Do you read all the messages you get from the public? Do you reply? And do you find correspondence with the public enriching or useful? Has the public had an impact on you? It's clear you've had an impact on the public.
Yeah, they do. I read most stuff. I'll often get a 5-page single-spaced rant or a manifesto and many book manuscripts and over the transom, as they say. And I don't read them. I read most. I reply to some fraction, just because of sheer time. I couldn't possibly reply to them all and still write books and teach my courses and so on. And I do learn two kinds of things from them. One of them is just how people react to what I write, and often people will bring things to my attention, so it is useful. And occasionally something that will come over the transom that just changes my life.
Wow!
I got a letter from a woman named Judith Rich Harris in 1995. She wasn't just any random reader, but because she had been a graduate student in psychology at Harvard and got kicked out because, quote, you don't fit our stereotype of an experimental psychologist. It was accompanied by an article that she had published in a peer-reviewed journal despite her lack of a university affiliation. So I saw that she had been vetted by the establishment. But what caught my attention was a fact that I knew from my own field that had seldom been remarked on, which is that kids don't grow up with the accents of their parents. They grow up with the accents of their peers. Huge effect. Virtually unstudied within my own field of language acquisition, but a powerful effect. And so always buzzing in the back of my mind was this fact that no one had really made much of. And then she reminded me of that and assimilated within a greater theory that socialization in general is much more driven by peers than parents. So it caught my attention. But she was an amateur, obviously a brilliant amateur. Yeah. And there are a couple of other cases in which that happened.
You recently turned 70.
I can't believe it. Sorry. Calendar doesn't lie.
Having recently turned 70.
Recently turned 70, yes.
Have you started thinking in terms of your legacy as a public intellectual? Does that mean anything to you?
I have to say not much. I mean, only in the sense that is, I don't fantasize about what people will say about me when I'm gone. I don't aspire to being remembered. As Woody Allen said, I don't want to achieve immortality through my work. I want to achieve immortality by not dying. But however, where it does enter is that I like to hold myself to standards that don't hinge on particular rewards that I will necessarily experience, but a kind of an as-if standards. That is, if I cared about what people will say, will my work pass the bar, pass muster? That is, the standards have to be beyond the material and reputational rewards that I get to enjoy, just as a standard to hold myself to.
Yeah. And looking forward, what's exciting you? What are you looking into next? Are you writing another book?
I thought you'd never ask. I have a book coming that I just finished, coming out in 2025, called When Everyone Knows That Everyone Knows: Common Knowledge and the Science of Harmony, Hypocrisy, and Outrage. So common knowledge is the state, it's a little bit different from the common meaning of common knowledge, but it's a technical term referring to the state where I know something, you know it, I know that you know it, you know that I know it, ad infinitum. So this is, I think, a deep and profound concept, and it's one with a lot of psychological implications, because knowing that someone knows that someone knows that someone knows, that's a mental activity. And so I wrote a book on, and I've done a number of experiments over about 15 years over our ability to get inside each other's heads, getting inside still other people's heads.
Very prolific, and the area of knowledge expands even further. Well, thank you so much, Steven Pinker. Total joy to speak with you. I really enjoyed having you on The Academic Issue. Thank you.
Pleasure's mine. Thanks so much.
Thanks. You've been listening to The Academic Issue, a podcast by University Affairs. To read more about public intellectualism, take a look at the links in the show notes. Stay on top of higher education news, opinion, and career advice by visiting universityaffairs.ca and sign up for our newsletter to receive weekly summaries of the big stories in Canadian academia. And don't forget to subscribe to The Academic Issue and leave us a review. We'd love to hear your feedback. You can also follow us on Instagram and X. Links can be found in the show notes. The Academic Issue is produced by Kate Kenyon, with audio production by FEL Creative. Thank you so much for listening, and see you next time on The Academic Issue.